Okay, good evening, members.
Good evening, Josam.
Josam Alecho is my name. And on this presentation, I'm being joined by Judith Chifola, Jessica Chalimpa, Rachel Komugisha, and Lilian Nalugwa. So that is the entire team that is making this presentation. So we are being tasked with a question. We are tasked with a question to illustrate the working of public sector comparator in undertaking value for money analysis, but also to look at the weaknesses of using public sector comparator in assessing value for money analysis and what suggestions can be provided to reduce the weaknesses that reside with the adoption of the public sector comparator as a tool in assessing value for money. So I'll start by defining what public-private partnership is. And this is, it's a long-term arrangement between usually the government and the private sector players or entities. The method of having this work is usually that the private sector company comes in to build, operate, and finance the project upfront, then at a later date draws revenue from the taxpayers. It's important to note that under this arrangement, the obligation to provide the particular or required service still remains with the public authority. So in this case, that's the government. But the work of doing the actual work is what is given to the private sector player. So the PPP arrangement is usually long-term in nature, between usually 20 to 30 years or even more. And the rationale for this is because the private entity that has been contracted by the government usually needs time to integrate service delivery cost considerations into the design phase of that particular project. Quick examples for the PPP arrangement in Uganda. One of them is the Umeme, whereby the government of Uganda concessioned the electric distribution asset to a private sector player that is called Umeme, and that happened way back in 2005. And the partnership was for a period of 20 years. The aim is to attract private investment capital that is required to refurbish the distribution network. So that is one of the PPP arrangements we have here. The other is the Chinese construction company that the government brought on board to construct the Kampala-Entebbe Express Highway. And what has happened is the French company, I think called Aegis, was contracted to do the toll collection that is on behalf of UNRWA. In other words, the French company is getting money now on behalf of the Chinese company, because the Chinese company used its money and it has to recoup it back through the toll collection that happens at the toll center. The other example I can give lastly for this is the Atiak sugar factory, whereby we have Uganda Development Corporation, which is a government agency that came into partnership with Horial Investment Holding Company, a private sector player, to come into partnership and set up the sugar factory to have things running. But at some point, the government, through the NADS program, went ahead to support the local farmers to go ahead and grow sugarcane in such a way for them to be empowered and supply the company. So that is one of the other example we have under PPP. Allow me to go ahead and define what public sector comparator is. So this is basically a tool that is used by governments globally in determining the proper service provider for a public sector project. Through public sector comparator, the government is able to test whether a private investment proposal offers value for money that is in comparison with the traditional procurement. So in other words, the PSC, or the public sector comparator, provides a benchmark for estimating value for money from other alternative bids. Yes, that is what I can say about that. Lastly, allow me to define what value for money is. So value for money is basically the utility that is derived from every sum of money spent. That for every sum of money that you spend, there has to be an equivalent satisfactory that is derived at the end of the day. And when that is achieved, then you've achieved value for money. So an important example in this particular case is the construction of the Kampala-Entebbe Express Highway, which is 51.4 kilometers. As most of us are aware that this is the most expensive road in the world. But you see, it costed over 476 million US dollar, with each kilometer costing about $9.2 million. Now, if you look at that road and you compare with other gigantic roads, better roads all over the world, you realize that so much money was put into that particular road, 51.4 kilometers only. And so I leave the question with you to really see if value for money was factored in that particular project. So at this very time, allow me to invite one of my other colleagues, that is Jessica, to take us through the working of the public sector comparator in undertaking value for money analysis. Jessica, please get right into the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessam. Briefly, the public sector comparator is a tool that governments use to estimate or project the net present cost to government if it has to deliver the project under a more traditional procurement method. And the value for money should be achieved if at all the government is to take that side. But if at all the estimate does not actually achieve for money, then the government will opt for PPP. Now, the public sector comparator has components when determining or estimating the net present cost to the government. And these include, one is the raw public sector comparator. Now, the raw public sector comparator includes the expected capital and operating costs to the government of delivering the reference project over its full time before any risks are taken into account. The public sector comparator should be checked against the service specifications to ensure that the whole life cycle costs of the government delivering the services to the prescribed standards are included. Yeah, and quite a number of components are considered into determining the cost of capital and operating costs. And these include inflation. The budget papers should contain projections for general inflation rate. It should consider the inflation given that such a project will go on for more than 3 years or more than, even beyond 3 years. It's usually a long-term contract, or they are usually long-term projects. And inflation is an item that should be considered adjusting. The other component, the other element that should be factored into when determining the capital and operating costs is construction and commissioning. For example, the design allowance, the planning at the point of commissioning the project. The other element is consultants' costs. For example, the design, when you look at an example of a project that is involving construction, let's say construction of a school, a hospital, it would involve things like design, build, and usually there are consultants who carry out such specialized works and professional works like design. You'll need quantitative surveyors, you'll need engineers onto the team, and so many other consultancies. So consultants costs should be considered. The other element that should be considered are other contingencies. It is important that the raw capital cost estimate included in the PSC should contain all contingencies, yeah, normally expected under a traditional procurement contract. The other element is maintenance costs, or when considering maintenance costs or estimating, one should consider whole life cost of maintaining the asset to the same standards required from the private operator in case it was to be done under PPP. The other costs that should be considered when determining the capital and the operating cost is the employee costs, and these could be directly or indirectly involved. For example, there are those employees who are involved into the provision of that service or delivering that project, and there are those that are not directly involved into that project. However, okay, for example, like maintenance costs, like maintenance workers or staff who do the maintenance, yeah? You may not directly attribute such a service to the project, but it's part of the project. It should be considered. The other element that should be considered is insurance. It should be looked at in conjunction with the risk analysis. And the other is the expected third-party revenue over life of the reference project. It should be deducted from the total operating cost of the raw PSC, because if at all it is included in there, it would reduce the cost of the PSC. It would reduce it. It wouldn't give the correct estimate. Yeah. And the other issue that should be considered element is residue value. Where the reference project involves the disposal of assets, the present of the income less disposal cost must be deducted from the raw PSC. And lastly, but not least, is the procurement costs. Yeah, all costs that are involved into the logistics of carrying out this project should be considered. That is, those are a number of elements that should be considered when estimating the capital and operating costs. The other component of the PSC is the competitive neutrality. Now, this component is it's the competitive advantage that accrues to the government by virtue of its government status. Give an example. In Uganda today, all aid-funded projects that are carried out by government ministries, government agencies, are exempted from payment of VAT, value-added tax. It is deemed that this tax was paid by government. So there's no money transfer from government to other contractors that the government has contracted or outsourced to carry out these traditional procurement projects. This project, I mean, under the traditional procurement mode. So it doesn't leave a leveled ground when it comes to PPPs, because for them, such an incentive is not given. They don't have such a benefit. Thank you so much. May I invite my other colleague, Judith Chifora, to continue with other components. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Yes, my name is Judith Kifola. I'm going to take you through the last two components. So the last two components are about the risk. I can't see the presentation, just because the last two components are about the risk. On the risk, we have the retained risk and the transferred risk. On the transferred risk, we look at what does the government save if it gave the project to a private entity. So with a transferred risk, the private sector comparator helps the government to look at, in case I am to undertake a delivery of a service. Let's say if I was to build the Entebbe Express Highway, Kampala Entebbe Express Highway. If I'm to build it as a public sector, will I have all the finances to provide, or do I have to go and get loans? So with that, with that, the PSC helps you to decide either to partner with a private company that will help you to save you from some of those risks, like the finance, the expertise, that's like the human labor and all that. Then when you look at the retained risk, the retained risk is the advantage of the public sector holding that project under them. If they perform the project, they will be saved from certain things whereby the private company will have to pay. Let's talk about the taxes. With the taxes, you find that most public sector entities, they don't pay the taxes, so you are saved from that. Some policies and regulations don't apply to the public sector, so that gives you an upper hand over the private companies. If you are to work with them, it gives you an upper hand. Then you decide, actually with this, I can either we can use the traditional procurement method to apply, or let's just decide to go with a PPP. So those are the two factors that you look at. Look at the retained risk and the transferred risk. Thank you very much. Let me invite my next colleague to come and take us through the weaknesses of the PSC. Thank
you, Judith. This is Rachel Komgisha. We've discovered the PS tool has its own weaknesses that have been encountered in the process. Number one, it assumes there are public resources. The public resources have to be available, which is very irrelevant, as most of the developing countries do not have some of these public resources in plenty. For example, public funds are not there to fund some of these contracts and projects. Then it takes into account long-term projects, which brings about project creep. Project creep, I mean the projects extend beyond than the originally agreed period. Hence, delays may incur in the process. Then there are also hidden costs that are supposed to be included, like inflation, but are never included in the process of using this PSC tool. It is also very time consuming because of certain principles that must be followed in making comparisons from different points of view. Then it also involves technical complexities, which require knowledge and abilities to apply some of these ability, knowledge and skills. There are certain principles that have and information which are supposed to be used, and some of these need like an education environment to be acquired. They need on-job training, which making it complex. I call upon Lillian to come and continue with some of the weaknesses.
Thank you, Rachel. My name is Lillian Nagwa, and I will present the other weaknesses that the PSF faces. The first one is inadequate evaluation of risk transfer. The costs are not always adjusted for some major risks in big projects. It actually involves omission of certain types of risks, as it ignores the fact that some risks involve huge potential effects on project costs with great losses incurred. Also, the PSC does not ensure addressing affordability. As for it, it looks at the value for money. It doesn't look at how much is going to be needed to invest in this project, hence becoming a weakness to use the PSC. And the other weakness is outcomes versus output. What is incurred is usually not what is harvested. When using the PSC, the government usually assumes what the output will be. However, actually what they get from that project is not most likely it's not what the PSC had projected. So those are some of the weaknesses that the PSC faces, and with the suggestions that can reduce the weakness that reside with the adoption of the PSC. These include multi-criteria analysis. That is where the government uses different analysis to compare different projects, so that to assess the value of money instead of using the PSC only. The next one is softening technicalities involved in using the PSC tool in both developed countries like the UK and developing countries like Uganda. There should be a move of softening the use of the PSC with simpler procedures. And the other suggestion is developing is disclosure of the multi-criteria analysis that during procurement. That is when the government uses a case-by-case approach instead of using other approaches. Then we have transparency and accountability. That is when the government uses procedures that the citizens can easily understand and things that are easily accountable for. And the other one is negotiating position. That is where the government gives other bidders opportunities to bid, to show interest in a given project and send in their bids, so that everyone has the opportunity to engage in a given project. Those are some of the suggestions to some of the weaknesses of using a PSC. I'll invite my other colleague, Judith Kifola, to take us through the other remaining solutions and to also conclude on this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lillian, for the presentation. Okay, so the next point is a level of disclosure. When we are doing a PSC, there should be a level of disclosure in every level that you undertake, right from if we're looking at the operating costs and capital costs, we come down to the continued neutrality, we come down to the risks. We should ensure that the level of disclosure is accessible to everyone, who's participating, so that the right information is good, that will be for good decision making. And then transparency and accountability, which Lillian already said. And then you have to look at the effect of competition on competition. When we are applying the PSC is supposed to show us the value for money. If we do a project and we see the value for money is not really there, are we being competitive enough as a nation or as a developing country? So the PSC should look at competition also as a factor. Now with this, let me come down to the conclusion. Just please kindly. Okay, with a conclusion. So using a PSC can inform a decision about value for money, but it cannot be relied upon to provide an inflexible and simple answer to the question. Yes, you can use a PSC to get decisions, for the value for money. But then you cannot rely on it alone. You should use other criteria to measure if really we should undertake this project under a public entity, or let's just do a PPP. Yeah. Then ensure that value for money decisions are not based on one dimension comparison of single figures. That's why I would say you should have an in-depth, there should be a position for negotiating. Give chance, let there be level, let there be disclosure, give chance to people to explain. So that shouldn't be one dimension of like, if we are using this route, we're not going in depth to inquire how are we going to process this, how are we going to purchase this and all that. Then a PSC focuses solely on relative costs, yet often used incorrectly as a comprehensive pass-fail test. Decisions need to be based on a realistic, systematic, and comprehensive analysis to benefit and risk as well as. So a PSC should be realistic in whatever decisions that it should be realistic. If this is a project, it's going to take you 30 years to run, or 20 or 15 years, it's going to be a long-term project. Whatever, there should be room for those hidden costs that you don't know. Yet the PSC doesn't consider those hidden costs, which affects the performance in decision-making and value for money. So while there are several approaches to assessing value for money, they are much more alike than different. Measure the public sector costs of a conventional procurement in similar ways. All have identified similar drivers that are very likely to make a project worthy. So in this, a PSC is just another tool that you use to determine the value for money for a project. There are so many other criteria you can use. With this, that's the conclusion I've given. Let Jessica, my other colleague, give the final conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith.